Here's how you can learn monolithic and microservices within 10 minutes. First, let's talk about monolithic. Monolithic application is very simple. Let's say you have a lot of functions within your application and it runs within this one server. Now that's what we call a monolithic service. Now, every monolithic has its own database. That's one big database that the structure use, which makes it very ideal for companies that is limited on resources because you're not using that much of a database, and not to mention that you run everything within one structure. Now, Monolithic has its own benefits. One, being easy and faster to deploy. Two, being it's built within this one code base. Now, easy and faster to deploy means that since it's running within one server, you can just deploy the application easily by one click of a button. Now, built within one code base, however, has its own beneficials. Now, one of it being that Node.js is one of the applications that, let's say, is the code base for this type of application that we're running in. Now, it uses JavaScript for all applications, which makes it ideal whenever there's a new whenever there's a new developer to learn the application. They only need to learn the JavaScript code base, and it makes it easy for you to resource or outsource people with JavaScript skills specifically. Now, the second thing is it doesn't require a lot of resources. And the last one is simplified testing. As we can see here, since you're only running, let's say, a server with 2 CPU, 4GB RAM, and 20GB of storage, all of them are running within the one server. All of the functions are in there, which means that the resources are shared within the whole applications, not to mention the database as well. And whenever there's an update or whenever there's some testing that you need to do, there's one click away for you to test that system, which makes it very simple and easy to use. However, it has its own challenges, one of it being a slower development. As you can see here, let's say you have a new developer joining your team. Now they have to learn every single app or function that you have in your application. This is going to be time consuming as well, because since we're running them on one code base, that means even though they run on that one code base, imagine if we run 10 apps or services. The devs have to learn those 10 apps and services to make sure he's know what he's working with. The second one is being not very reliable because, like as I mentioned before, to restart the application, you have to restart. To update the application, you have to restart the whole server. The next one is being expensive to upgrade, and it's not really a very reliable machine because, as you can see here, sure, the application is shared within this one server and restarting is very simple, but it's going to reboot on every upgrade or any code fixes and updates in the future. This also means while the server reboots, the whole app will not be available for your users to get to use. Not to mention that every upgrade means the whole server will be upgraded, which is going to cost a lot of money, especially if you're already scaled your monolithic servers. Sure, you can still scale this, but you're limited to what we call a vertical scaling. Vertical scaling, for example, is having this main app server and duplicate it into a scaled server. Now, this means that every single function that you have in your main app server has to be the exact same features within the scaled servers, which makes it not practical and not to mention time consuming. Now, let's talk about microservices. Microservices is very common to big companies such as Netflix and Spotify. Now, both of them use microservices because the benefits it has is very amazing. One of it being that every single app runs within its own cluster or container. Now, they still have this main database for every app, but they're not too dependent on that main database because they can still run with their own database that they have within the cluster. Now, the benefits were, one being the database on every service, which means that you're not going to lose, if you lose your main database, you're not going to lose your whole application. And even though you lose this one application, you're not going to lose your whole database, which makes it very reliable. The next one being that microservice is a parallel structure, because once you have a down cluster, it's not going to affect any other of your it's not going to affect any of your functions. The app would still run fine even when there's a cluster broke down, which makes it very reliable to use, and your users will still have access to the application without having problems or issues. Now, the next one is the flexibility on scaling. As you can see here, you can just easily add 3 more clusters to run your application. Not to mention that you can run duplicate functions to make sure, let's say the 3 on the left has this payment function. If one server is down, you still have 2 more to go for you to use in the future. So that's what makes microservices a very good option. It's very reliable, and it's also easily to scale because you're not limited to your resources. All you have to do is deploy the function with the database, and you're all good. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's also reliable to use because you can have each cluster having to be upgraded or restarted without bothering other applications, without bothering the whole function of the application itself, which makes it a very good option, and especially if you're looking to get 100% uptime in the future. Of course, it doesn't always going to be skittles and rainbows. You're always going to find challenges in every structure. In microservices, one of it being the development has its own challenge. By this, I mean that you can have multiple development teams and they could use different code bases. Let's say a team uses a JavaScript-based codes and another team is using Go-based codes. This could be a challenge, and it's going to be difficult to organize because you're gonna have a organization overhead issues in the future. Not to mention, when you're gonna debug this application, it would be a challenge because not only that you have to learn 2 or more different languages at the same time, it is also going to be time consuming for you to figure out what's wrong with your application. The next is infrastructure cost, because it is known that microservices is very, very expensive on resources. So you have to keep that in mind. Because if we compare it to Monolithic has a shared resources because you can run every application or functions within this one server, and it's always going to be one for all, which means one server for all functions. And it's also a centralized unit. Sure, it's going to be expensive to maintain, but it's going to be easy on your resources because you're not going to spend that much money on infrastructure cost. However, microservices, it's going to be expensive on the resources, but they're easily expandable. Whenever you want to add a new function or a new cluster, you're not limited to that. But every cluster needs a huge resource, and it's going to be difficult to organize once you have a lot of clusters within your microservices app. Next is the organization overhead problems, as I mentioned before, and the lack of standardizations. Now, not only the debugging itself is going to be challenging, but since you have a company that runs, let's say, 3 different languages, it's going to be difficult for you to, one, look for new developers that has mastery with 3 code bases. Even though if you're not looking for this one person that can do 3 of them, it's going to be expensive in the future for you to maintain that development teams, because not all developers could learn 3 languages. Usually they're specialized in 1 or 2 languages. Since the app uses a lot of programming languages, this is going to be difficult. Developers would use their preferred code base, but even if we give them that freedom, it's going to be difficult for us to organize it. Now, which one is actually better? Comparing monolithic to microservices, it's not as simple as you think. If you're a new startup, or let's say you're a small team of developers, monolithic is a way for you, especially if you're employing your new applications. Sure, most companies now use microservices, but most of them also start from monolithic. Even sites like Stack Overflow doesn't really jump into microservices because they don't see a point for them to upgrade to microservices itself. So monolithic is still an ideal thing for you to start your company, or you're just a small developing team that deploys new applications. However, if you're a huge company with huge development teams, It's way better for you to run microservices because it's more fast, it's more efficient for you to deliver new features, and it's easy to maintain the applications within the microservices structure. If you have one broken cluster, you're not gonna be flustered or frustrated that your application won't run properly, or you're worried that if you do this, the whole application would crash, because everything runs on its own cluster. You only need to fix that cluster and you're all good. Thank you for listening. This is Monolithic and Microservices. I will see you in the next video. Share your comments down below.